On the next panel, we have two veterans of the U.S. Senate. Jeffrey Bergner is a longtime aide to Richard Lugar of Indiana and served as staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Gerry Warburg is a foreign policy advisor to the Democratic whip of the Senate, Alan Cranston. Both have strong academic backgrounds and have both taught, ironically, at both Georgetown and University of Pennsylvania, among other places. Without getting into a long discussion about their varied and rich backgrounds, I think we'll just begin the program so we can focus on the substance, and we'll begin with Gerry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pirchner. Thank you very much, Dr. Pirchner. Before I begin, a quick salute to my sparring partner. The young people in the room will have heard talk about the good old days when the Senate worked and issues of great consequence were advanced in bipartisan fashion. The truth is that Secretary Bergner and I did great combat in those days, almost daily. We worked for opposing party leaders, and we represented two very divergent political philosophies at times. We fought hard, but it was never a zero-sum game. There were no final victories and no permanent enemies. And it's my earnest hope, particularly for some of the younger staffers in the room, that you might experience that same type of interaction across the partisan aisle. Now, our host has challenged us to address 4 controversial topics in 10 minutes, and Jeff and I have a small bet on this. So to provoke you, I'm going to go over 4 points rather quickly. The first one is that White House and especially civilian policymakers have often proved too ready to use force in places where I believe smart power might have proved more effective. Look at some of the successes of smart power in places like Chile and Salvador and Colombia and Burma, and indeed much of Eastern Europe. Contrast that with disasters such as George W. Bush's decision to invade and occupy Iraq, or the insertion, then retreat under calamitous circumstances of U.S. Marines into Lebanon following Ronald Reagan's policy in 1983, or the folly of our failed war against Nicaragua's Sandinistas. The use of force by presidents since Viet Nam has, in my opinion, very often suffered from a lack of sustainability, transparency, and an exit strategy. You would do well to ask, indeed, what exactly is the United States doing in Afghanistan 15 years after 9/11, if it's not nation building, the policy that George W. Bush specifically ran for president against? Second point, I believe the drift on the fringe of both major political parties towards isolationism and unilateralism is unhealthy. It harms our ability to pursue U.S. national security interests. We must strengthen alliances against terrorist networks, not retreat from them. Threats from climate change to cyber attacks require greater multilateral collaboration, not less, to secure U.S. interests. A third point, which we heard articulated very effectively in our previous panel from some members of the intelligence community, is that the Powell Doctrine is more essential than ever. To maintain credible, sustainable military commitments, we must first secure U.S. voter support. Americans overthrew a king in good measure to ensure that one ruler could not commit the nation to war without the express approval of the people's representatives in Congress. Fourth, and perhaps most provocatively, I would appeal to the liberal Obama-Clinton supporters in the room to join with our libertarian and conservative strict constructionist friends to check what, since 9/11, has been an out-of-control executive on the issue of war powers. This ought to be an issue where admirers of Bernie Sanders and the Koch brothers can agree. Article 1 of the Constitution is crystal clear in giving Congress the power to declare war. The next Congress, in my opinion, is morally obligated to rein in executive excess and to make the people's representatives accountable by regular public votes for the sacrifices we ask daily of our brave soldiers. Now let's put today's debate in historical perspective. For a generation, Republicans were said to be strong on defense, the Hawks. They were eager to use sticks, not carrots, to use force unilaterally, from Grenada to Iraq, from Afghanistan to Lebanon. From the whole bogus who lost China debate of the 1950s to the ever-growing defense budget of the post-Cold War decades, the GOP's position was quite clear. Democrats were caricatured as doves, labeled weak on defense. They were eager to restrain enemies' nuclear arsenals with international treaties. They were determined to secure U.S. popular support, even UN votes, before making foreign military commitments. Now, Democrats and Republicans were united on such common sense questions as maintaining a strong NATO alliance or checking expansionist Soviet policies. Obviously, these party caricatures no longer fit. The Republican establishment has been bitterly divided by the demagoguery of their isolationist standard-bearer and his admiration for the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Indeed, scores of leading Republican foreign policy professionals have endorsed the Democratic nominee. A substantial portion of thinking Republicans now ask why we still have so many forward-based troops. They ask, what are we doing paying for the defense of Japan and Germany 70 years after World War II ended? Many believe that allies from South Korea to Israel to the Baltics should pay for their own defense. Some embrace a come home America logic with calls for greater investment in U.S. infrastructure and new trade barriers. Listen very carefully. You can almost hear George McGovern and big labor being channeled. Today, it's hard to recycle the old saw about Democrats being weak on defense. It's true that Obama seeks multilateral accord before inserting U.S. forces in some instances, but it was Obama, not Bush, who made the unilateral strike in Pakistan and took out Osama bin Laden. Obama has made very aggressive use of drone attacks and cyber war against multiple nations, as our previous panel pointed out. And Obama has been unrestrained in his use of force by a Republican-led Congress. Obama has focused on ISIS. He's even made cyber attacks against Iran. His would-be predecessor, Secretary Clinton, is far more internationalist than the libertarian Rand Pauls or the Donald Trumps of the alt-right. Now, there remain some important points of bipartisan consensus I'm sure we'll talk about. Before we commit forces to combat, per the Powell Doctrine, the U.S. has to have clear national security objectives, an exit strategy, and the express support of the American voters so the commitment can be sustainable. And we need to revitalize the American economy and rebuild our infrastructure, another bipartisan point of consensus. Now, Professor Bergner and I will have different views on the wisdom of force in certain instances. To telegraph, I believe the Reagan invasion of Grenada, for example, was an embarrassing distraction from a much more pressing Middle East challenge. The fact that 8,000 medals were given out for killing a few dozen soldiers on a Caribbean island is a little bit beyond the pale. The Reagan deployments in Lebanon were similarly ill-considered. And of course, the Bush-Cheney rush to war in Iraq has become the most tragic U.S. foreign policy error since Pearl Harbor. One key point about unilateralism: the rhetorical champions of American First are deeply suspicious of any international accords. I understand they fear these will compromise U.S. freedom of action. But recall, they rejected major nuclear arms accords advanced by Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. They demagogued the Panama Canal treaties, clearly in the U.S. interest in retrospect. They're delighted that the U.S. Senate, since 1998, has refused to pass any international treaty, from nuclear test bans, from environmental protection accords to the TPP, most any agreement. Critics fear multilateral accords will give socialists in Europe or dictators in the UN Security Council control over U.S. interests. But the fact is that many national security threats facing the United States today are not primarily a contest between two sovereign nations. Man-made climate change, which is already now taking lives and threatening economies, is not a contest between two nations. Same with counterterrorism or cybersecurity or Russian military imperialism in Crimea or communist China's occupation of South China Sea islands in violation of international law. I believe U.S. interests are much more effectively advanced in such cases if we act multilaterally in concert with our allies. Our generals get this. Why can't our politicians or our would-be leaders? A final opening comment about the use of force. If conservatives are truly strict constructionists, and I believe they are, how can they contest the crystal clear statement our founders made in the Constitution that only Congress can declare war and fund it? The Constitution is not ambiguous here. Congress must vote to authorize wars of choice. And I believe we're far stronger as a nation when we have that public vote to back a commitment of U.S. forces. Soldiers who fight and die to advance U.S. interests deserve to know their political leaders are accountable. That is why I support the bipartisan initiative to reform war powers laws and ensure troops know voters have their backs. In conclusion, I believe we're a stronger nation when we use force in a much more accountable fashion, and that we heed one of our wisest foreign policy presidents, John Quincy Adams, and go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Making the public case for military commitments is an obligation of leadership. You lead people. You try to explain the logic of your proposed course. It is what George Washington did, and Lincoln, and the Roosevelts, and Jack Kennedy. Leaders do not go abroad searching for villains among the 192 nations we share this fragile planet with. Leaders do not play the demagogue, trashing our generals and our war heroes. True leaders do not whip up xenophobic fears and reflexively oppose all things multilateral while refusing to explain the cost and consequences of the policies they propose. The use of force requires accountability. We need to put long-term military commitments to public votes. To do less is unseemly for the world's oldest and greatest people's democracy. Thank you for your interest. I look forward to your questions and to learning from my friend, Secretary Bergner.
The reference to...
Well, thank you very much, Gerry. I look forward to mixing it up a bit with my friend and colleague from UVA here. Gerry and I agree about some things, and we disagree about other things, as you will soon see. Let me just offer a general defense of the use of military force as a tool in achieving American national security interests. And to do that, let me just take the 4 points that Gerry made serially and spend a couple minutes on each one and respond. I think that may frame the debate going forward in the clearest possible way. First, on the use of force generally, I don't think the evidence supports the view that presidents, and I think that's what we're talking about here, have been too quick, too eager, too willing, too ready to use force. To the contrary, if you look at the period since 1973, when we withdrew our forces from Viet Nam, and I think this is a good period to look at, these 43 years, we fight very much differently now than we did in Vietnam and before, for a number of reasons and in a number of ways. First of all, no president is interested in another episode like Vietnam, in which we lost 58,000 American lives for an objective that was not very clearly defined. Secondly, in 1973, the Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which has, at least to an extent, affected how presidents and Congresses work with one another. Third, we have now an all-volunteer military. Not since 1973 have we used conscripts or draftees to fight. Fourth, we have other changes, the Goldwater-Nichols Act and a host of other things. We spend a good bit more time and attention on how to fight effectively and efficiently without risking unduly American soldiers' lives. And so we fight very differently. In these 43 years, since 1973, there have been 12 major instances of the use of U.S. force abroad. A number of smaller ones, to be sure, but 12 major ones. And by major, I mean either with a very substantial number of U.S. forces, or for a very long duration, or with a considerable number of casualties, or with a very broad notion of what we're trying to achieve, like regime change, or in some cases, 2, 3, or 4 of these goals. Just 3 real quick points. First, in every one of these instances, presidents have worked very hard to try to accomplish the ends which they sought to achieve by using force as a last resort, not as a first resort. One can go through the diplomatic history of these events and understand this, that presidents have used diplomacy, they've used economic means, they've used political means, they've used moral suasion, they've used other allies to try to change things. And presidents, I don't think, have been too quick or too interested in repeating the Vietnam episode. And I think for anybody who's watched presidents visit with families of the fallen or visit with people at Walter Reed, I think it's a bit of a misleading statement to say we've been too quick to go to war. No president, no modern president, maybe Teddy Roosevelt, but no modern president glories in this at all. Secondly, I think because we do fight more carefully now, and maybe more cautiously in a way also, I think the record of success has been somewhat better. There have been some obvious failures along the way, and I would name 2, one of which Gerry mentioned. Our experience in Beirut in 1983 and our experience in Somalia in 1993 were failures by, I think, any metric that anybody could devise. I would make an argument, and I'm sensitive here that what I'm really making right now is an assertion, not an argument, that you can make an arguable case that the other 10 times we've deployed military force, the deployment of military force itself has been successful. And a lot of times the follow-on decisions, which were not implicit in that necessarily, have been what the problem was. I would just say, if you're interested, I think next Monday or the Monday after, I've got a piece coming out in the Weekly Standard, which will detail in gory length all of my thinking on these 12 instances. And so if you're interested, it'll be available in a week or so. But finally, and maybe most importantly, a lot of times there's a kind of a false dichotomy put together here in which the costs of action are put against what? The costs of inaction? No, the costs of action are put against nothing. For example, if you look at the Gulf War in 1991, we can identify what the costs of that war were. We can identify how many Americans lost their lives there. We can identify how much American treasure this cost, what the follow-on consequences were in terms of American pilots having to fly no-fly zone monitoring missions for more than a decade afterward, and a number of other things. We know what those are. We can count those costs up. But to what do we then compare that, or to what do we contrast it? And what we usually contrast it with is nothing, as if the current situation would go on simply forever without any change. And that, I think, is an unfair way to look at this. In particular, I don't think there's anybody in this room who could tell me to a certainty that Saddam Hussein would have remained perfectly content to stay in Kuwait and not proceed an inch further towards the Saudi oil fields if he were unchecked in Kuwait. I understand all of the arguments about Kuwait as a province of Iraq and all the rest of it. But I would just offer as evidence, the Saudis themselves were scared to death that that was what was going to happen if we didn't deal with the Kuwait situation. And there is no way in the world Saudi Arabia would have allowed hundreds of thousands of American forces to go onto Saudi soil if they didn't think this was an existential threat. So, second point, multilateralism. Sure, why not? Of course. We should always act multilaterally if our friends and our allies will be helpful, without a doubt. What could be wrong with that? But this sometimes blends over too quickly into the notion that we've not acted multilaterally enough, that we need to act more multilaterally. And I would just submit that with regard to these 12 instances of the major use of military force between 1973 and 2016, 10 and arguably 11 of these were all conducted multilaterally, all conducted under UN Security Council resolution auspices. And by the way, those are not so easy to get because they require the tacit approval of Russia and China, or with our NATO allies, or with non-NATO allies, or in many cases with all three. In particular, all of these actions took place under the auspices of enforcing United Nations Security Council resolutions. Beirut, Somalia, the Gulf War, Bosnia, Haiti, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. All of these took place with our NATO allies. Kosovo, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Iraq, Libya, and now more recently ISIS. And so I think arguably the one case of unilateral American action in all of these 12 instances was George H.W. Bush's invasion of Panama in 1989. This was not a multilateral action. This was a unilateral action, without a doubt. Although there has been, as you all know, a little bit of a special history we've had with Panama, and the fact that we had many thousands of American forces already in the canal zone when this occurred. And so this might be, I don't know, a bit of a special case, but certainly in 10 or arguably 11, and I will come back to Grenada if you'd like, the United States has acted multilaterally. And so the notion that we're careening around the world in a unilateral way, I think, is a bit of a canard. We should act multilaterally where we can, but we have done that over and over again since 1973. Third point, popular support. Yes, of course. It's very important in a democracy, and it's especially important for a war or a conflict that goes on as long as some of these have, in particular Afghanistan, which is now the longest running continuous war in American history. We had more time with the Barbary pirates, but that was episodic. This has been continuous. Let me just make a couple of points about this. First, each one of these 12 military actions was strongly supported by the American people, strongly supported, including, by the way, Iraq, which received bipartisan votes, authorizations in the Congress in a much more fulsome way than the Gulf War had in 1991. Much stronger bipartisan votes in 2003, by the way. Secondly, there's a notion around that the American people have become war weary, to which I would ask, weary of exactly what? What is it exactly that the American people are weary about? 95% of Americans have sacrificed exactly nothing for any one of these or all of these conflicts all put together. Not anything, not even a dime of tax money, since you guys in Congress always prefer to borrow the money rather than to pay for it as we go. Most Americans have not sacrificed anything. The sacrifices that we've entertained have all been assumed and taken on by one very narrow slice of the American public, and that is the people who serve in the all-volunteer military and their families. This is where all of the sacrifices come down, and why it is that the average American should be war-weary, I'm not too sure. Most Americans could not name one single solitary way in which their lives have even been inconvenienced in one way for one day by the totality of the use of force that the United States has engaged in from 1973 until the present. I was going to ask you to think for a moment, how many Americans do you think have been killed since 1973 in combat? But our previous speaker was kind enough to tell us the answer to that. Roughly 7,480 Americans have been killed in combat in the last 43 years in the 12 major hostilities we've been engaged in, including and especially Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a bit crass to do this, but that averages out to about 170 American loss of lives per year. Each and every one of these is a very sad and a very difficult experience, and I would be the last person in the world to minimize this. A number of these people have been my friends, their parents are my friends. I live down in the 2nd District of Virginia in a neighborhood full to the brim with Navy SEALs and their parents, and many of these people are friends. And so I would not in any way seek to minimize it, but just to put this in a bit of context for you. In the year 2015 alone, 16,000 Americans were killed in homicides. 28,000 Americans killed with opioid overdoses, prescribed or not. 35,000 Americans killed in highway traffic fatalities. Altogether, more than 80,000 Americans killed in 2015 alone in traffic fatalities and in drug overuse situations and in homicides. And again, this is not to diminish in any way the sacrifice which any one of these 7,480 people have made, but it is to say that I think in context, this certainly suggests that this is not a blood-soaked imperial regime we have here, or a regime or a country that is too quick to want to go to war. It has been our assumed responsibility, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, but it has been our assumed responsibility in the last 43 years to try to bring a degree of civility and order to the world, and we have lost 7,400 people in the process. The average American, by the way, is 200 times more likely to know someone who's been killed in a car accident than anyone who's been killed in combat in the last 43 years. Last point real quickly, and then I'll stop. On the question of war powers in Congress, I am in complete and total agreement with my colleague, Professor Warburg. Congress, to its credit, has authorized the use of force consistent with the War Powers Resolution, which was its own creation, by the way, the War Powers Resolution, on the 3 biggest occasions of the use of military force: the Gulf War, the Afghan War, and the Iraq War, all to the good. Congress also authorized, by the way, consistent with the War Powers Resolution, the activities we undertook in Beirut, which turned out not well. On the other 8 occasions, Congress has simply been AWOL, and has not lived up to the responsibilities prescribed for itself in the War Powers Resolution. The War Powers Resolution was in part designed to check presidents, but in equal or greater part to compel the Congress to step up and take a position on whether the use of force is something which is going to be authorized or not authorized. Now, in 1 or 2 of these 8 cases, it may be understandable. The Panama invasion, for example, came and went so quickly that Congress was out of session the whole time for Christmas recess. Although, in the case of a war, Congress might have bestirred itself to come back for a day, but nevertheless, some of these situations, Libya, Kosovo, Bosnia, ISIS, have gone on for months or years, and Congress has still not acted. And in fact, the situation with regard to ISIS is right in front of us now. So far, ISIS, Congress has done nothing, has preferred simply, as my colleague has said, to let the president do whatever he pleases in Iraq and in Syria. So far, a lot of the action has been from the air, more than 13,000 coalition airstrikes, most of which have been ours. But increasingly, we are now putting troops on the ground. We have now more than 6,000 U.S. forces in Iraq, more than half what we had when the president drew them down and took us out of Iraq, quote unquote, in 2011. Okay? Congress has a very difficult time with situations in which presidents fight wars where the casualties are not very high, where they're minimal. But in this particular case, despite what all four of the presidential candidates who will appear on the ballot have to say about no boots on the ground, no boots on the ground, it's a little bit late. We already have 6,000 or 12,000 if you count both feet, 12,000 boots on the ground in Iraq. And we're going to have more as the operation to move toward Mosul continues, and more of these are going to be on the front lines. And so I just leave it with you to think about. If Congress were to do nothing about ISIS going forward, this, I think, would be something of a disgrace. Now, just so I don't end on a totally down note, let me just say I share Professor Warburg's optimism. I think there are ways that sensible people can work together. I'm much more sanguine about it when it comes to national security issues than I am with domestic issues, where the country is really riven in parts and has two different visions of where to go. But I think that if we're going to work together, it has to be on the basis of a very dispassionate, a very non-ideological, a very non-partisan understanding of what we've done and what we haven't done, not trying to score political points, what we've done, what we haven't done, why we've done it, why we haven't done it, how we've done it, and how we haven't done it. And I think if we do that, in all fairness, one will conclude that there is a significant role for the use of military force in securing American foreign policy and national security objectives, and in some cases even an indispensable role. So with that, I will stop and turn things back over to our moderator.
Okay. Because Jeff talked a bit longer than you did, Gerry, maybe you want to respond, and I'm going to have a question to you both, and we'll go to questions from the audience.
I'm just delighted that we agree on a lot of things, and I'm struck by the contrast between the consensus that we enjoyed in a certain era and the challenges of today. I guess the one observation I made, without being argumentative, is it's true that the U.S. casualties have been thankfully somewhat limited. As the son of an Army intelligence officer, I'm grateful for the limit to U.S. loss of life, but they've certainly had profound consequences around the world and in other populations around the world and in other countries around the world and in refugee movements and, of course, for the people of Iraq and other countries in the Middle East. And I have a European friend who said to me the other day, gosh, we really ought to be able to vote in American presidential elections because the decisions that you make have such a profound impact on our lives. And I think that's certainly true in other regions of the world as well. But thank you for your comments, Jeff.
Okay. Everybody has talked about the use of multilateral coalitions. And I wonder if both of you could address the problems inherent in working multilaterally with Russia in the Middle East. As was mentioned, Russia's main ally there is Iran, who is in opposition to American interests in the Middle East. Russia is a government under Putin that has broken practically every agreement that's been made over the last 2 years and some treaties of long standing. And yet there can be a reason for tactical cooperation. But how do you work with somebody that doesn't keep their word and whose long-term interests are different than those of the United States?
I suspect we have a point of deep consensus here because I do not trust in any way, shape, or form the Russian influences in the Middle East. I note that Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem in part because he was concerned that the Russians might get back involved in the Middle East. And I believe the United States should be extraordinarily wary of their influences and the pernicious impact of Mr. Putin. I clearly have a favorite in the current presidential campaign, but I would just say more generally that one has to have a sober and realistic understanding of the nature of the dictatorship on the march advancing now in Russia, and a willingness to use U.S. force and work with our allies to check the influence of Mr. Putin. And I think it's crystal clear there's only one candidate who has that approach, and the other one has a shocking, really dispiriting naivete about Mr. Putin's objectives. With that, I'll turn to my colleague.
Well, I'll leave aside the comments on the election coming up, but I think beyond that, we do have a very strong consensus about this. I would only point out that this is not a brand new problem. It's not a problem that's just arisen in Syria in the last few years. We have not really had a confluence of interest with first the Soviet Union and then Russia, with the exception of a couple years in Russian history after the Soviet Union's demise. We've not had a confluence of interest with Russia for many, many years. I can tell you all too clearly from hard personal experience the number of times I came back and forth here from the State Department up to the Hill to explain to senators and congressmen how difficult it was to try to get Russia to cooperate with even the most elemental, sensible UN Security Council resolution dealing with Iran's nuclear program. We had to work overtime to try to get Russia and China to agree with us on even the most minimal kinds of sanctions against Iran. And so this is a problem of long standing. I think maybe it's a kind of a misplaced hopefulness that when a new group comes in, they think, well, we are the ones who can now break through the fog and find that great confluence of interest that must exist between us and Russia, between us and the former Soviet Union. I think that's just a mistake. I think we need to look at it in a very clear-eyed way. There are undoubtedly some things we could agree on with the Russians, but there are some things which we cannot and never will, as long as we have the system in place over there that we have.
I just wanted to add one comment on that because I think of our old friend John Kerry and the brief he's had to carry in dealing with the Russians, extraordinarily difficult. I don't want anyone to misunderstand that I agree with Professor Bergner on the necessity of the United States acting unilaterally to secure our national security interests. In fact, I had an opportunity to talk to my 92-year-old dad this morning, a U.S. Army intelligence officer whose brief went immediately on Eisenhower's staff from following German tank formations to following Russian tank formations in about a week in 1945. And if the United States had been unwilling to act unilaterally against Japan, I might not be here because he and his buddies were about to go invade Okinawa before the United States saw fit to act unilaterally in Japan. So I support unilateral U.S. military action when our national security interests are at stake.
We'll go to questions from the floor.
Reed Smith, Charles Koch Institute. You mentioned these kind of 10 or perhaps 11 major military operations. It seems to me that the biggest difference between those and what we're facing now is those actually ending. Do you see any prospects for a global and permanent preventive war ending?
Not on the horizon. Let me simply say, I share Gerry's view. It is unclear to me what we're hoping we're going to achieve in the 15th year in Afghanistan that we did not already achieve in the 14th year. It is very unclear to me upon what that hope is based. And so I would say, and here I would not dissent from some of the comments that the first panel made about nation building. It's a very difficult thing, very difficult. It's much harder, I think, than we thought it would be. We tried it in Somalia, it didn't work so well. We've tried it in Iraq, it turned out to be very hard. We've tried it in Afghanistan, it turned out to be even harder. We've tried it in Libya in a different way by simply bombing the hell out of the place and then standing back and letting the Libyans sort it out. And that hasn't worked so well either. And so I think the short answer is I don't see anything quite on the horizon like that for some of the reasons that Michael, our first panel's speaker, mentioned, and that is that when wars ended with Germany or with Japan, they were ended by the nations of Germany and Japan. The countries were done, they'd had enough. Whereas when you fight against these more difficult groups that are at each other's throats in Afghanistan or Iraq, as Michael said, every one of them has a tape in their head about how if they don't play their cards just right, someone from another sectarian group is going to murder them. I don't think Japanese had that feeling about each other or Germans had that feeling about each other. And so I am not wildly hopeful that that would be the case.
Let me just add, two of the most articulate individuals on this topic, to my mind, are war hero, Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman John McCain, and formerly a junior senator from Virginia, a guy by the name of Tim Kaine. They have pressed Congress to be on the record on when this war might wrap up, and if it's not going to wrap up, which in my opinion it's not going to. I think we're going to be battling extremist Islamic fundamentalist terrorists for a generation. Let's be honest about that. But to use the authorization for the use of military force after 9/11 to go after Al-Qaeda, which we've now decapitated, and use that as a justification in the year 2030 or 2040 to continue to prosecute this war, I think is a mistake. And one of the most striking things of a series of 8 interviews that our students conducted with members of Congress last week, 4 Ds, 4 Rs, was their frustration that they haven't been held accountable by having to vote on this stuff. They actually want to be on the record, most men and women of goodwill in the United States Congress, to let the soldiers know we've got their back, and if there's an exit plan and an exit strategy or a time limit, vote, be accountable. That's why you ran for office in the first place.
Can I just jump in and add one more thing about Congress? I don't mean to be so critical of Congress since many of you work there, but I think one of the places that Congress has the hardest time trying to figure out what it wants to do in terms of authorizing the use of force or not is in these situations of relatively fewer casualties, where presidents can fight wars, and Libya is the perfect example. From far off with very few, or in this case, no real American casualties, Congress is not sure how to act. And it seems to me that the problem of technology is making this a bigger and bigger problem for Congress, that increasingly presidents are going to fight wars with minimal amounts of casualties, with standoff weapons and with drones, particularly, and that if Congress is ever going to have a role again in speaking about the question of when and how should we use force abroad, somebody's going to have to do some pretty hard thinking about it, because it's not at all obvious to me that Congress is really in a position to step up and take a position on these kinds of tough issues. Somebody's going to have to do some hard thinking about that, I think.
Let me just underscore one key point there. And the previous panel noted that on Labor Day, the President of the United States undertook drone strikes against 6 different nations. And I want to be fair in my challenging of partisans. I'd made some tough remarks about my friends in the grand old party. But I challenge Obama Democrats. Imagine how you'd feel if a President Dick Cheney had undertaken 6 drone strikes against 6 different nations on Labor Day. Or a President Dick Cheney had used drones to kill American citizens who were overseas without engaging the Congress in the way that's authorized and required by the Constitution. I think Democrats would be singing a different tune. So I think they're morally obligated, as well as my Republican friends, to be held accountable.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kevin Meister from Human Rights First. The other day I went to a hearing of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman Adam Smith asked an interesting question saying we had different strategies of involvement in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Iraq, we went all in. Libya, we bombed, but we didn't have troops on the ground. And Syria, we essentially didn't act against the Assad regime. And in all 3 cases, there was no good solution. And there's ongoing civil war in Syria. So, and in the other cases, it's ongoing war. So, what would be a proper strategy of intervention or non-intervention for the U.S. to adopt in these conflicts?
Sure. Well, again, I'd make a couple of points about that. First, one has to, I think, compare the consequences of action with the consequences of inaction. And you can say, well, none of these have worked out right, so we shouldn't do anything. But I'm not sure that follows quite so clearly. It may well be, and I personally think in the case of Libya, that we were a bit oversold here, a bill of goods by the opponents of Gaddafi about the impending bloodbath, and President Obama, based in part on this notion of responsibility to protect under the UN Outcomes document of 2005, thought we should intervene. He couched it in terms of American interests, but it was really more a question of American ideals, I think. And Gaddafi had come around quite nicely, actually. He had become more or less, from what he was, a murderer and a terrorist, to become increasingly aligned with the United States. We were working very hard at the State Department, and when I was there, to reestablish diplomatic relations with Gaddafi, to open embassies in both places, to appoint ambassadors, to rebuild our embassy in Tripoli and so forth, all of which was delayed only by the ongoing legal issues from the Panama 103 dispute. But this was a situation in which we did create for ourselves this kind of exchange. We may have prevented a large loss of life on the ground, but in exchange for it, we've had an ongoing smaller loss of life, and we've had, in addition, several places in ungoverned spaces where ISIS now exists. It's unclear, as I sit here today on September 26th, that was a very good bargain from the standpoint of American national security interest. I am still willing, and Gerry may faint here, to give President Obama, which I don't customarily do, the benefit of the doubt here and say, if it so should turn out over the next couple of years that we roll up the ISIS, the Libyan government rolls up the ISIS spots in Libya and is able to pull together some kind of a regime to have some kind of order in Libya with some kind of decency and moderation, it may still be that this was something that turns out all right. But I think the jury's out on that, and there are a lot of ifs in terms of that scenario, and I might also add that the only way that could happen is if the U.S. military, which it is, helps Libya to roll up the ISIS cells in Libya. So I take the point. We haven't found a particularly good way to reconstruct places that are falling apart, whether we're the agent of helping them to fall apart or whether they're just falling apart on their own without us.
I would really entertain a more sweeping statement in answer to the gentleman's question that it has not served the U.S. interest in any of those three cases to be involved with ground troops, and I think Iraq is the most obvious and clear example. I'd also just try to clarify for the record that I believe while many Democrats deeply regret their vote for the authority for George Bush to use force, the explicit request put to them was to give him the stick and the threat so he wouldn't have to use it. And I don't think any of those senators who are publicly explaining their votes, including probably again tonight, Clinton, Biden, others, were voting for a 15-year occupation of Iraq and the kind of expenditure of money and treasure and lives that we've countenanced. But a broader point that I would just challenge the audience to consider that Jeff has alluded to, the use of technology becomes very attractive for these standoff wars where we don't put boots on the ground, where we send drones. And my friend, former U.S. Army Special Forces, Dean Allen Stam, says, if you don't care to send your very best, you're not sending the right message. If the United States is just going to stand off and throw tomahawks and throw drone strikes, the clear inference for folks on the ground is we don't care enough to send our soldiers, just wait us out. And I think in some cases, it's akin to beating a hornet's nest with a baseball bat and then walking away and being very surprised that you've stirred up trouble. So I think it's incumbent upon us as scholars, think tanks, politicians, moms and dads, to think very seriously about what new technology and wars of the future imply for the revitalization of our democratic institutions, like having Congress vote accountably on these issues.
Amen to all of that, except every single United States senator knew exactly what they were voting for with the authorization to use force in Iraq. It was to use force in Iraq, not to threaten Iraq with force. We'd already threatened Iraq with force, on and on and on. And so I think this particular latter-day reconstruction of motivation is not right. It's really not right. Secretary Kerry knew what he was doing. Hillary Clinton knew what she was doing. Joe Biden knew what he was doing. They all voted for the war, each one.
Well, the great thing in this instance is we have their detailed positions based on intelligence explicated in the congressional record, and we don't have to go back to tapes of the Howard Stern show to see where the candidates stood at the time.
Yes?
How many hours have we got? I think
you might repeat the question.
The question was, what are U.S. national security interests in order to determine whether we should indeed go to war? I'll try to give a short answer. It's hard. It's kind of like the justice's definition of pornography. I can't tell you, but I know it when I see it. A U.S. national security interest is a threat to the continental United States and our two states that are not continental. It's a threat to our lives, our values, our economy, our environment. That's why I say climate change is a national security threat to us presently now. It's causing seawater rise in our cities, in Jeff's hometown of Virginia Beach. It's causing hundreds of thousands of people to die prematurely in cities like Beijing. So a national security interest is a threat to the lives and livelihood and values of the United States. Careful, that last word gets us in trouble, because when we go abroad trying to promote our values by force of arms, it does not work well. And that's where you have to draw a very clear distinction of whether it's worth committing force and killing people to advance our positions. But I hope I'm going to learn a better answer from Professor Bergner.
Well, I'm not sure. I agree with most of what you said. It has always seemed to me there are two kinds of arguments against using force. One is what I might call a pragmatic argument. Is this really important to the United States, this outcome? Can this not be achieved in any other way? Even if it is important, are the costs acceptable and not so high that we wouldn't do it even if it were important? And third and finally, have we thought through the consequences of action and inaction as best we can, and knowing that we will only be able to do that imperfectly? Those arguments, it seemed to me, are very reasonable, sensible arguments that any policymaker will confront. There's another set of arguments, so-called moral arguments, which seem to me weak and so simple as to be simple-minded. And that is, we have no moral ground to intervene anywhere outside the United States. Now, from whence cometh that position, I would ask? This is as much as to say that it is the United States position, as found in the Declaration of Independence with the universal rights of man, that any country that happens to be taken over by some guy, whether the rest of those people in that country like it, he can oppress them, abuse them, murder them, kill them. That's quite okay with us, because that's what these people have, quote, decided to do for themselves. I think it's better that we stand with the people of other countries as opposed to tyranny or despots. And I have no particular compunction in saying, I think in not only these 12 cases, but probably in 50 other cases around the world, we would have every solid moral ground to intervene if we felt like it, but that there are many practical reasons that should hold us back from feeling like it. And so I have not ever been persuaded by this so-called moral view. You know, was it a particularly moral position not to aid people in Africa when the Hutus and the Tutsis were fighting it out? When 700,000 people were hacked to death, burned to death, or otherwise tortured to death, and 2 million people displaced, when a very small amount of American military presence might not have prevented all of it, but would have prevented most of it. Now, we may have had good practical reasons not to do that, but morality doesn't strike me as being one of them, you know? And I think Bill Clinton would agree with that if he were sitting here. He said a while back that was his deepest regret about his presidency, was that he did nothing about that, when it would have been relatively so easy to address it.
Let's pursue the question of values a little bit more. We've heard in these debates a question of nation building. Now, in countries that have had a democratic tradition in their post-communist life, they were able to translate that tradition into democracy, such as Poland. But what about countries in the Middle East with no democratic tradition and arguably nowhere near a critical mass of people that were small d Democrats that have believed in democracy? How do you evaluate the arguments that say with military force we can make democracy where there are no Democrats?
I'm highly skeptical. As a strong and longtime supporter of our alliance with Israel, I haven't seen that kind of democracy flourish in other countries. And indeed, that's one reason I've been so critical of the current government in Israel, because I think they're ignoring that fact, and I am not a supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government for that reason. There are very few examples. Stephen Kinsner, in his book Overthrow, chronicles 125 times presidents have used force without military authorization. Indeed, 14 regime change attempts since the annexation of Hawaii. I confess I'm a little sympathetic to the annexation of Hawaii, where my mom lives. That worked out pretty well. There's a very vibrant democracy in Hawaii. But in most of the other cases, it's worked out very badly. You think of Iran, 1953, you think of Guatemala and the United Fruit takeover, you think of the Bay of Pigs, and you think of the disastrous long-term impact of the United States trying to impose democracy with the force of a gun. And indeed, in defense of some of our policies, and both our presidents, I think in the end, we shy away from that goal often. We say, no, we're just trying to promote stability so we can get out of here. And that's something where probably President Bush and President Obama share some objectives today on Iraq and Afghanistan. They just want to go home. And I would finally point out, trying to be bipartisan, defending President George W. Bush, he ran for president as an isolationist. Domestic agenda, come home America, no nation building. He was critical of the Clinton administration for its attempt at regime change and nation building. And it wasn't by choice that he was handed a war against terrorists who attacked our country in multiple sites. And I certainly understand his feeling a need to respond in Afghanistan. I will never understand his decision to go into Iraq. I think it was a serious mistake.
I would agree. I think you'd almost have to be blind not to have learned how difficult it is to build a country up in the first place that doesn't have any traditions of the kind that you're trying to inculcate. It turns out there's a very big difference between rebuilding nations, as we did so successfully with the Marshall Plan after World War II, but we were rebuilding nations that were very much advanced and developed and very much like the United States before the war. And there's a big difference, it turns out, between that and building up a nation in the first place. I think nation building is probably too forward-leaning a goal to have anymore, and I think even regime change, which is a bit narrower an objective than nation building, is itself extremely difficult if what you mean by that is a regime that looks totally different than the prior regime and looks a lot more like a liberal democracy. That too is difficult, and I don't think we've, to be honest, solved that problem. Yes?
Hi, I'm Molly Cole, formerly with USA in the State Department, and it seems that both of you and our earlier panelists all seem to agree that the use of force abroad should be limited, and that there are just disagreements about how to define the vital interests we want to defend. And so if we take that perspective, I want to ask about our civilian tools of development and diplomacy. What is the appropriate role of using those, and how do we prioritize the use of those resources to maximize impact and prevent the need to use force abroad later on?
Sure. Well, you will recall from back at the time when I was at the State Department between 2005, 2008, the phrase went around as we've reinvented ourselves yet again for the 100th time, the 3 Ds. Democracy, development, diplomacy, and defense. And certainly, development and diplomacy have huge roles to play. I think my only point would be is that the world is not such a perfect place, it seems, that you can always accomplish what you might need to with those two alone. And that there are times when, for better or worse, the third D is necessary. It would be very nice if it weren't. I know there's a certain notion out there that if you just do enough development, you can basically accomplish what you want to without any use of force at all. Would that were true, it would be great. But it's hard for me to see that working out so well in some instances. We should stay at it, and you can point certainly to places where it's made a positive and tangible difference, I think. But it has, I think, its limits.
I would, not surprisingly, subscribe to the idea that smart power and soft power are extraordinarily valuable investments. My favorite Republican intelligence leader, Robert Gates, likes to talk about the fact that there are more members of U.S. military bands than there are foreign service officers. And obviously, the extraordinarily small amount of our gross national product that we spend on foreign assistance versus our military budget, I think is way out of whack. I think we've actually been more effective in promoting U.S. interests with targeted foreign aid. And here again, I will compliment President George W. Bush. I believe the investment he made in humanitarian relief and in combating the AIDS crisis in Africa will be one of the greatest parts of his international legacy. And I'd like to see the the United States taking those targeted creative approaches, when possible in concert with our allies, but if necessarily alone, for the same interests that the left and right share, to make us a stronger country and a safer world where we can then do the investments we need to make in our own infrastructure and our own economy. And as I said before, I sincerely believe those are the type of issues where the Bernie Sanders left and the Charles Koch right can work together and ought to find some common ground.
We're down to the last question. Yes?
Hi, my name is John Park. I'm a graduate student from the Women's School of International Affairs. I wanted to ask, because you both are highly in favor of greater oversight over the use of force and other such issues. Perhaps the biggest criticism, or at least the one that comes to mind, is that in a world in a world in which the nature of conflict is changing to transnational organizations and non-state actors, greater military oversight and restraint foreign policy makes the United States government clunky, for lack of a better word. That the United States government will fail to respond in time to everything from, I'm including transnational actors, to mean everything from ISIS to Colombian drug cartels or piracy in Southeast Asia. How do you respond to something like that?
The question was how, in a fast-moving world where technology and the force of events occurs so quickly, how do you involve the legislative branch in a meaningful fashion in deliberations? Really good question. I teach a class on the 21st century political challenges for the young people, and technology will be the #1 challenge, because how you adapt our system of democracy to a changing world where the pace of change itself is accelerating is key. My short answer, sir, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to anticipate the types of challenges we might face, to pre-brief a leadership committee of Congress, to have them available in real time, to consult, and I don't mean to be informed while the planes are in the air, but to consult with the President of the United States. The President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the former Secretary of Defense were all members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where Dr. Bergner and I were privileged to serve as staff members. They know, and they gave eloquent speeches about the importance of having Congress be accountable and involved in this process. And they reverse themselves, because where they stand is where they sit. They appreciate the unilateral authority to act that they have seized and run with. It is incumbent upon the 538 members of Congress, left and right, liberal and conservative, to get our system back in whack. And as I say, it's not that hard to have real-time communications with the select committee of congressional leadership about an ongoing crisis. And it's certainly appropriate to give authority in advance, as we do indeed, for strikes against terrorists, where the intelligence committee is sometimes informed about covert actions. So you can set processes in place to anticipate some very foreseeable events.
Yeah, I have nothing really to add to that. It's hard, but it's not that hard. And a lot of the times Congress has taken umbrage because it's too hard. It isn't hard at all. ISIS, this is not a surprise. You could still authorize the use of force against ISIS if you felt like it. This has gone on for 2 years, going into a third. And so that, technology moves fast, but sometimes these events don't move quite so fast, and there's plenty of time for Congress to do what Gerry just described, I think.
And just to be clear, I think you've seen some wonderful quotes. I want to say Jack Kington of Georgia and Charlie Dan of Pennsylvania, acknowledging on the record, Google it, that in fact members of Congress like to have it both ways. If they don't vote, they can make up their position after the fact. If it turns out well, they were all for it, he should have done it quicker. If it turns out badly, they say, no, it didn't go well, or run around the country saying they were against the war in the first place because they said something on the Howard Stern show. You need to have stuff on the record, people accountable, public roll call votes. And this is something where I truly believe the left and right can work together.
Okay. Just a couple of comments before we formally thank our wonderful speakers. One, on the question of high-tech and national security, the American Foreign Policy Council has a wonderful program in that area run by Rich Harrison And on the table outside the door, you'll find 3 of his recent publications on cybersecurity, on missile defense, and on drones, with many more to come. Also, those of you that looked at the program, the advertisements for this forum, knew that Will Ruger was going to be moderating this panel, not me. Will was caught at an airport in New York when his plane didn't take off on time, so I had to sit in at the last minute. But he sends his regards. And now we've really come to the end.
Can I add one last thing?
One last thing.
One last thing. I feel like I've been very critical of Congress, and maybe that is some of you that work in Congress. So I'd like to conclude on a more optimistic note. You guys have got one thing certainly right. The big debate today is not that thing that's happening at 9 o'clock. It's the American Foreign Policy Council debate. So that's it.
Well, thank you, and thanks so much to both panelists.
Thanks, Jeff. Great work, everybody.